questions before we move on? Anything you want to chat about? No, we good? Yes, sir?
Do you think that like reparations should just go to like one like group, or like should it target like people that are in the same kind of like socioeconomic like group? Because
That's an interesting question. What do you mean by that?
well, like there are like white people that have like been disenfranchised like recently, like by
Recently is the key. Recently is the key.
Well, the country like deindustrialized, right? So like a lot of people in like manufacturing jobs and stuff, like
Right.
areas were affected.
But
by
so
poverty.
to your question, I think you have to understand what the word reparations means first. So reparations, you are repairing something that you have broken. You are paying for something that you were supposed to pay for. I'm not saying that there aren't people living in America today who are suffering and are going through pain and strife because of what's happening when it comes to the machines taking jobs, factories becoming industrialized, etc. But reparations is a specific conversation about a specific time in America, and that is black people were slaves. You know what I mean? I've even heard people say like, oh, but there were some of the Irish who were indentured. Like, yeah, slavery. Look at the numbers, look at the time, look at the level of work. You could not work toward your freedom. For most black people in America, this was a time when you lived and died as a slave. And so that's what reparations is about. And so I hear what you're saying, but I think that's a completely separate conversation that needs to be had about the now. Because if you are not careful, what you then do is you combine everybody's suffering into the same bowl, and you make it seem like all injustices have the same weighting, and they don't. It's just like crimes. You know, theft isn't the same as murder. We don't try them the same way. And as much as there is a white person who's suffering today, I feel for anybody who's suffering, because I know what it's like to be poor. I know what it's like to suffer. I didn't come from a wealthy family. We struggled when I was growing up. But I also understand that there are levels of that suffering. You know, and so sometimes white people, it does block a white person, because you go white privilege, and a person goes, I'm poor and I'm white. Where's the privilege? You know, white people are like, I wish I could activate my white privilege. I wish I could do it right now. White privilege, give me something. I get that. I get that. Trust me, I get it. It is hard to accept that you have benefits because of the color of your skin if you cannot see the benefits that you have. But the thing I try to explain to a person is, think of it more like golf. Don't think of it as privilege, then think of it like a handicap. Right? In golf, they acknowledge that you are in a position where you need so many advantages to be competitive in the game. Right? So what they say is you have a handicap of 15, so that means like you're going to be hitting from this tee and you get more chances to get the ball in, because we understand the position you're in. And if you're a black person in America, from slavery, from day one, the number of injustices that have held black people back in America amount to an insurmountable, like you look at black people's freedom, you look at black people's land, just land alone. The amount of wealth you can acquire over time if you own land is exponential, because you have the land, you have the fact that you can borrow based on the land, you have the fact that you can use the money that you have borrowed to grow more wealth, you can use it to grow your family's wealth. Just taking that away from black people alone is crippling them. And so you combine that with slavery, and then you look at Jim Crow laws. You didn't let black people in America live in the areas that they wanted to live in. They couldn't get loans from the banks that they wanted to get loans from. And then on top of that, when they started getting the loans from American banks were found to be giving them higher interest rates, when in fact they were the same risk as many of the other races that they were giving loans to. So when you combine all of those things, I think it's safe to say that black Americans have a conversation that they need to be having with the United States. Doesn't involve me, doesn't involve white people, it's like, yo, American government, meet the black people. That's it. Have that conversation.
In 1838, Georgetown University sold 272 people to Louisiana to save the university from bankruptcy.
Among those that were sold were my ancestors.
That university would not be here today had it not been for my grandparents.
That was a long time ago, but the effects of that are still felt today.
There are disproportionate negative outcomes for those who were descendants of slaves that can only be explained by the fact that this enslavement happened, reparation didn't happen, and now is the time.
In October, Georgetown University announced that they would raise $400,000 a year for the descendants of the 272 enslaved Americans that were sold to Louisiana. They said this money will be spent beginning in the fall of 2020.
My family might be making history in the United States.
I might become one of the first in the history of America to receive reparations.
Mechanicsville is the area that is heavily populated with Georgetown descendants, including myself, where I grew up. And Mechanicsville is less than half a mile away from where the plantations were where our ancestors were enslaved. I mean, you had people on very low income. Sometimes they didn't have any income. Some of us have done well if we were able to get out and get an education, and a lot of us haven't, and they could, really use some assistance or help.
We may be the first that receive some form of reparations for slavery. It may start with you.
Well, I think it would be a wonderful thing. Start out with me, and let it continue on with everybody who would be in need. There's so much I missed out on, but from the goodness of God, I'm still here. My mom, I will never forget, had one dress. She'd wash that dress out at night and hang it on the back of her chair to the fireplace to dry, to have it to put on the next day. And my mom, patches on top of patches.
So what do you think that, just maybe one thing you think that Georgetown should do?
Well, my house could be upgraded, for one thing.
In my community where I grew up, reparations would definitely help.
If I was given reparations, I would definitely set some of that money aside for my son's future.
My first thing is to get something for the elderly people.
I would feel that my ancestors are rejoicing in heaven.
It's $400,000.
For each family?
No. It's just $400,000 for over 7,000 people.
No, not much.
Do you think 400,000 come close to what we need as a people? So it's 400,000. Okay, so the descendants that's living now, you put that at how many? About 8,000?
It's about 8,000. It's
okay.
Probably more.
Equal $50. It's a slap in the face, not just a slap in the face, that's a kick in the behind also.
Georgetown University is currently deciding how this money will be spent, but said it will go towards projects that support descendant communities.
I think Georgetown has such an opportunity here to take the lead on this.
I don't think they should go bankrupt, but $400,000 is not going to do it.
Someone in authority at Georgetown needs to come down and actually meet with each descendant and see what each descendant needs.
We don't need to make white people wrong. We don't need to make Georgetown wrong. We need to ask ourselves, what do we need to do to ensure that all of Americans have full access to every right that it means to be an American?
It is 6:42 now. It's time for the Culture, where we highlight D.C. area history, traditions, and cultural issues that matter. The White House has served as the home to some of the most powerful leaders in the world, but the people who helped build it are often an afterthought. This week, our Michael Quander explains how a new online exhibit is attempting to honor their lives.
Enslaved African Americans are often left in the shadows of American history, but many of our ancestors helped to literally build historic landmarks here in D.C., including the White House. Now, the White House Historical Association is exploring the history of those enslaved people with an online exhibit called Slavery in the President's Neighborhood.
I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves.
Former First Lady Michelle Obama reminded America of the slave labor that went into building the White House during a speech at the Democratic National Convention 4 years ago.
And I watch my daughters, two beautiful, intelligent black young women, playing with their dogs on the White House lawn.
In its online exhibit, the White House Historical Association linked more than 300 enslaved men, women, and children to building and staffing the White House through the early 19th century. Historians found enslaved people were involved in every aspect of construction. They cleared the land, cut stone and wood, created bricks, and built the walls and the roof. White House records show where those hundreds of slaves came from, and it was from all over the DMV. This interactive map shows slave owners rented out their slaves to help build the White House from as far north as Cecil County to down south in Southern Maryland and Stratford, Virginia. Payroll records show slave owners were paid for each enslaved person. They were marked with an N before their names for Negro. The exhibit also shows an extensive timeline of enslaved and free African Americans in and around the White House, and there's a list of all of their known names. Now, there are still pieces of their stories that were never documented and may be lost forever. But historians say their goal with this project is to return these people to the forefront of history. Reporting for WUSA 9, I'm Michael Quander, doing it for the culture.
Just like we have the myth of de facto segregation, we also think we know what public housing is. It's a place where poor people live, where lots of mothers with children, single parents with children, lots of young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, acting out, engaging in oppositional behavior that attracts attention to the police and a cycle of violence that we've seen in so many places. That's what we think of as public housing. But that's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country as a program for middle-class, working-class families. During the Depression, poor people were not permitted into public housing when public housing was first created. There was a housing shortage, and public housing was created for people who could afford to pay the full rent in housing, and they did in public housing, but for whom there was no housing available. Everywhere, the Public Works Administration and the other federal agencies that succeeded it created segregated public housing, separate projects for African Americans and whites, in cities all across the country, frequently segregating neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated, that were integrated. During World War II, the actions of the government intensified to create segregation. They intensified because throughout the country, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production, of war production, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression. And the migration of workers into centers of defense production overwhelmed frequently the communities where they were working. The federal government had to build housing for these workers if wanted the ships to be produced. For the African Americans, they built the housing on temporary housing because the explicit A goal of the housing was that African Americans after World War II would leave and go back to the South. So they built temporary housing for the African Americans along the railroad tracks and near the shipyards. And they built more stable housing for the white migrants in the white residential areas. Very soon after that, now in the mid-1950s, a development occurred everywhere in the country, which was systematic, similar, and widespread. And that was that suddenly, all the white projects began to develop large numbers of vacancies. All the black projects began to develop long waiting lists. And soon the situation became so untenable, so conspicuous. You couldn't have projects in the same city, some of which were virtually empty, and the other of which had long waiting lists. The federal government and local housing agencies opened up all projects to African Americans. And then at about the same time, industry left the cities. Fewer and fewer jobs became available to the now increasingly and soon almost all African American population in the public housing. The population could no longer afford to pay the full cost of its rent, so the government had to begin subsidizing public housing. Maintenance declined in the projects. Prior to this, maintenance workers lived in the projects. They were paid good salaries and lived in the projects. Upkeep declined. The projects became vertical slums that we came to associate with public housing today. Another federal program that was perhaps even more powerful in creating racial segregation, and that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration designed to move white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. At a racially explicit basis, we created a white noose around every urban area with federally subsidized single-family home subdivisions. These were giant subdivisions in many cases. The most famous of them, I'm sure you've heard of it, is Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes in one place. What bank would be crazy enough to lend a developer the money to build 17,000 homes or 15,000 homes in one place for which he had no buyers? We were in a suburban country at that time. People thought the whole idea was lunacy. Who's going to want to live in a single-family home when they can live in the city instead? Any of these developers, the only way they could get the capital to build these giant subdivisions was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development for approval of the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design, the layout of the streets in the subdivision, and an explicit commitment not to sell a home to an African American, required by the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration even required, as a condition of these guarantees, developers like Levitt to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. These deeds still exist in these homes today. They're no longer enforced, no longer enforceable, but they're still there. What was the consequence of this? Well, those homes in those days, in all of these suburbs, they sold for $10,000 or less, $8,000, $9,000 a piece. In today's money, that's less than $100,000, probably $90,000. African Americans who were prohibited, not they didn't want to, not because they didn't like living among whites, they were prohibited from moving into these suburbs, and they could easily afford to do so. Any working class family can afford to buy a home for $90,000, roughly twice national median income. Those homes and developments like that now sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 and more. The white families over the next couple of generations gained, you can do the arithmetic, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in equity. They used that equity to send their children to college, to take care of medical emergencies, to take care of economic downturns, most importantly, to bequeath it to their children, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans who accumulated none of that wealth as a result of this federal subsidy had none of those abilities. Today, nationwide, African American incomes are on average about 60% of white incomes. African American wealth today is 10% of white wealth. That enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. It's a constitutional violation, and of course it determines the ongoing racial inequalities we have today.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the Chairman Nadler, Chairman Cohen, and the Ranking Member Johnson, as well as thank Congresswoman Jackson Lee for inviting me to be with you this morning. As pointed out, I am currently the Secretary of State for the state of California, the first African American who's ever held that position in a 170-year history of the state of California. And so I come to you today as the author also last year when I was in the Assembly of AB 3121, our reparations bill. For us in California, we are very clear that we need not ask whether there or not slavery has had an impact, but instead illuminate the extent to which it has had an impact. We are through AB 3121, which is law in California, are establishing the task force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. It will consist of experts who study slavery's impact, educate Californians, compile a report of their findings, and provide information and recommendations to our legislature as to what we need to do to repair the damage done as a result of slavery. The body that will exist, the task force, it will encompass experts in fields such as history, ethnography, law, and civil rights. But more importantly, the body will consist of those who understand how we as Californians still reap the consequences of slavery, both nationally and in our own state. California's history with slavery is often not well known, but between the statehood in 1850 and the end of slavery in 1865, California, though named a free state, had many laws and rules and regulations that basically made it a haven for slavery. California legislature authorized Southern slaveholders to hold persons in bondage so long as they entered the state under an enslaved property state. We did not provide sanctuary to any slave who was basically seeking freedom. In 1852, we adopted the most harsh fugitive slave law in the country, encompassing state and local law enforcement or authorities to enforce self-emancipated persons living within the state back into slavery. The California Supreme Court ordered fugitive slaves, as in the case of Archie Lee, to return to its enslavers in direct violation of California's law. And until the end of the Civil War, California's city, county, and law enforcement authorities enforced the fugitive slave law. They enforced also a contract labor system that was no more than a slaveholder's effort to maintain their slaves in bondage. In other words, California state, county, and city authorities actively supported the institution of Black slavery, both within and beyond the borders of California. So this history is often not a part of California's lore, that we somehow never believed that California was this free state and had no discrimination that existed in the state of California. But it should be noted not only that every attempt that has been made by African Americans to attain wealth that was enjoyed by others has been met with violence in this nation. Not only involved the Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, but also the Allensworth story in California. We have not only taken away the good part, that African Americans had started, but the campaign of terror met by African Americans has tactics such as fear-mongering, lynchings, discriminatory voting laws, lower wages, denied home ownership, and these tactics have led to inequalities and the reality in California. According to Governor Newsom in 2020 State of Black California, that we make up only 8% of California's population, yet we make up 43% of the homeless population in California. We also make up only 5.6% of the male population of California, yet we make up 28% of those who are incarcerated, Black men who are incarcerated. So the recent population and also shows us by any indication that African American children, despite the fact that they have been in California for many years, continue to perform at the lowest level that's possible. And of course, COVID has emphasized to all of us, the COVID-19, just the disparities that exist in California in terms of the deaths and the health system that has failed us all. In sum, the age of enslavement, both in California and across the nation, birthed a legacy of racial harm and inequality that continues to impact the conditions of Black life in California. People have suffered various injuries and losses through the malicious culpability, negligence, and conduct of others that have the right to, and we have the right to redress. Interestingly enough, California we have had reparations in many areas throughout in California in this nation, and yet none have felt the need to provide it for African Americans. The task force is currently being established. We hope that the recommendations that will come forth will be recommendations that will begin to repair the damage done to us in California. By no means does this mean that there should not be federal reparations in any sense. The law clearly states that. But out of all due respect, Californians can no longer wait for the national government to do its job. We believe that we must do what is necessary for Californians and be an example of what can happen in this nation when there is serious discussions and research done on African Americans and the impact of slavery. We hope that the nation will join California in forming a task force to be able to address the issue of reparations and the damage that has been done and continues to be done as a result of engagement in slavery. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. Congresspersons, it's a privilege to address you today. I'm a professor of law at UCLA School of Law, where I'm a core faculty member of the Promise Institute for Human Rights and the Critical Race Studies program. And my areas of expertise include international human rights law and the global governance of racism. I'm also the United Nations Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. In this role, I'm an independent expert who's appointed to provide counsel to UN member states regarding, among other things, the meaning of their obligations under international human rights law to combat racism, racial discrimination, and to promote racial equality. My testimony today is drawn to a great extent from a report I presented to the United Nations General Assembly in 2019 on the urgency of reparations for racial discrimination rooted in transatlantic slavery and colonialism. International law recognizes reparations as necessary for rectifying wrongful acts and providing accountability for human rights violations. Within the international legal system, reparations entail a specific framework and responses, which I describe in full in my written testimony. But briefly, within the system, reparations are defined broadly to require restitution, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. Popular conceptions of reparations are often fairly narrow, focusing only on financial compensation. But by contrast, the international system places emphasis on a more comprehensive approach, according to which financial compensation may certainly be necessary but not sufficient. Other required measures may include transforming the political, economic, and social institutions and mechanisms for disclosing truth and restoring dignity for those subject to racial subordination resulting from legacies of enslavement. Notably, general measures such as social welfare programs that benefit racially subordinated groups, including people of African descent, that are pursued in the ordinary conduct of government are not a substitute for reparations. Fulfillment of state reparative responsibilities requires tailored interventions that are rooted in acknowledgement of the underlying harm of violations these interventions seek to remedy. In the context of racial discrimination rooted in slavery, reparations address two sets of human rights. First, the historic racial injustices of slavery that remain largely unaccounted for today. And second, the contemporary racially discriminatory effects of structures of inequality and subordination that have resulted from failures to redress the racism of slavery and of colonialism. There's broad consensus in the international community that the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in general did not terminate the racially discriminatory structures built by those practices. And the consensus is that transatlantic slavery and colonialism remain among the root causes of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance against Africans and people of African descent. As a result, in addition to implicating individual wrongful acts in the past, reparations for slavery implicate entire legal, economic, social, and political structures that enabled slavery and which continue to sustain racial discrimination and inequality today. This means that the urgent project of providing reparations for slavery requires governments not only to fulfill remedial obligations resulting from specific historic wrongful acts, but also to transform contemporary structures of racial injustice and of inequality and discrimination that are the product of centuries of slavery. National commissions, such as those proposed by HR 40, are well positioned to tailor recommendations to the specific legal contexts which sustain racial inequality. In the United States, the history of transatlantic slavery has left an indelible mark. the continued presence of racism, racial discrimination, ideologies of racial superiority in U.S. legal, political, social, and economic structures underscores the interconnection between the historical wrongs of slavery and contemporary injustices. I've joined other UN experts in noting that reparations are not just useful mechanisms for fulfilling moral or political obligations. Rather, reparations for slavery are an integral part of fulfilling the international legal mandate to eliminate racial discrimination. The United States is not exempt from these responsibilities, and HR 40 would represent important progress in fulfilling its obligations under international law. Reparations for racial discrimination rooted in the transatlantic slave trade have proven controversial in the countries that bear the greatest responsibility for the associated violation. In cases where states have pursued reparations for slavery and colonialism, they have done so in racially discriminatory ways. Notable historical examples exist where whites who have profited and benefited for the most from chattel slavery and colonialism received monetary compensation, while non-whites in their nations were partially or wholly left without redress. The Reparations Commission proposed by HR 40 presents an opportunity for the United States to show international leadership on what can be achieved when sufficient political will exists to remedy historic and persisting racial injustice associated with the enslavement of people of African descent. Among the most significant barriers to the pursuit of reparations for people of African descent in the United States and elsewhere is the absence of comprehensive accounting of the harms of slavery, and the Reparations Commission would provide the foundation for this accounting. Thank you very much.
Let's look internationally. Two of the best-known cases of government reparations occurred in Germany after World War II and South Africa after the end of apartheid. First, Germany. In the wake of World War II and the systematic genocide of approximately 6 million Jewish people, the German government, as well as many German banks and financial institutions, paid billions of dollars to Israel and to individual survivors over the course of decades. The German reparations program was created in 1952, when the first Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, signed the Luxembourg Agreement with Israel. And as of its 60th anniversary in 2012, the agreement had seen Germany pay out approximately $89 billion. The requirements and payouts have varied as the generations who lived during the war have aged and died. For example, in 2011, the requirement for receiving compensation as a survivor of a ghetto was reduced from 18 months spent living there to 12 months. And in 2012, the program was open to survivors who lived under Soviet rule countries, making approximately 80,000 people eligible for payments of $3,250. Now let's turn our attention to reparations made in South Africa. In this case, the reparations came more in the form of truth-telling and public hearings rather than direct financial payments. In 1994, after Nelson Mandela was elected president after the country's first democratic and free elections, the country looked for ways to heal the harm caused by previous regimes. Under South Africa's apartheid government, there had been years of racialized violence against the Black population. Laws banning interracial marriage and requiring Black citizens to live in under-resourced communities and carry identification documents were just some of the violence committed under apartheid. But the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also known as the TRC, set up nationally televised hearings where Black South Africans were able to publicly name the indignities they had been forced to suffer over decades. Although many of the perpetrators showed little remorse, the TRC started in 1995 with testimony from 21,000 survivors, 2,000 public hearings, and 7,112 amnesty applications that shed light on the government's systematic abuses. The TRC shone a national and international spotlight on the human rights abuses of the apartheid era. However, the financial reparations promised through the TRC were extremely limited. In 2003, President Thabo Mbeki announced that one-time payments of around $4,000 each would be made to 18,000 survivors of apartheid who testified before the TRC, and the rest of the money would be placed into development programs for all South Africans. Through these examples, we can see that reparations can take many forms. It can be through direct payments, apologies made, community investments, or truth told. But what these disparate examples demonstrate is that reparations for past harm are a possibility and have been historically throughout the 20th century.
Redress is the act of restitution, and historically, in the context of other initiatives for reparations, redress has frequently taken the form of monetary payments to the victimized community or the members of the victimized community. A couple of illustrations are pertinent here. One is the German government's payments to victims of the Holocaust. And a second example is closer to home in the United States, where the US government made payment to the Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II, internally incarcerated, subjected to mass incarceration. So the second dimension is redress. The third
Chair Cohen, thank you so very much for this opportunity. I also want to thank my sister friend, Congresswoman.
The mic may not be on.
Okay, sorry about that. What do I have to do? I have to-
Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank my sister friend, Dr. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and my twin sister over there, Congresswoman Karen Bass. People frequently comment on our resemblance. And of course, Congressman Nadler, for your work and your leadership, Keenan, and Dr. Ron Daniels, who was here and has been mentioned for his leadership of NARC, the National African American Reparations Commission, on which I serve. I am delighted to be here because this hearing is not on time, it's like overtime. It's more than time for us to deal with the injustices that African American people not only have experienced in history, but continue to experience. I'm an economist, so economics is a study of who gets what, when, where, and why. It's a study of the way the factors of production are paid. The elements are land, labor, capital, and the secret sauce. Some people call it entrepreneurial ability, some call it creativity. Land gets rent, labor gets wages, capital gets interest, and the secret sauce gets profits. But the work of predatory capitalism is to figure out how to extract more from the factors of production toward capital and away from people. And we've seen that in the past 3 decades with our own economy, but more importantly, enslavement was about the devil's work of predatory capitalism. Indeed, enslaved people got no wages, and we represented capital for other people. And so after enslavement, first of all, enslavement was the foundation on which our country was built. So anybody who says, well, I didn't have any slaves, no, you didn't have to have any. What you had to do was experience them, enjoy the fact that they were here, enjoy the fact that their labor made it possible for there to be a Wall Street, a bond market, and all of that. But beyond that, I want to speak specifically to Section 3B3 of the legislation. That's a part that talks about the federal and state laws that discriminate against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants who are deemed United States citizens. From Robert Higgs in a book called Competition and Coercion, Blacks in the American Economy, 1865 to 1914, he shows that in 1880, the ratio of black to white wealth was $1 black dollar for 36 white dollars. 1890, 1 to 26. 1900, 1 to 23. 1910, 1 to 16. Today, 1 to 20. In other words, we're almost worse off in 2019 than we were in 1910 because of evil. Because basically there have been deliberate attempts to marginalize African American people, especially those who are formerly enslaved, because of the interests of predatory capitalism, and because it was expedient to maintain the status quo of having free black labor and to prevent wealth accumulation. Despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, black people were treated as other and perniciously and viciously excluded from the possibilities of economic advancement. The Emergency Land Fund documented the reduction of black land ownership between 1910 and 1969 from 16 million acres to 6 million acres. How and why? Land grabs, tax schemes, faulty deeds, and downright force. My own family in Moss Point, Mississippi, experienced the expropriation of land through a moving fence, like the fence moved one night. We used to have the land, and we didn't have the land. Years later, after a couple of cousins were lynched, they changed the name of the land to Hawkins Lane, so they named it after us, but we didn't get it back. Joseph Brooks in 1978 estimated that black folks were losing 6,000 acres of land per week. And we saw what happened with the agriculture department. The post-enslavement case for reparations can be made by examining racially hostile public policy and government complicity to white supremacy. You all have an article that I wrote for the ACLU that talks about several cases: Memphis, Wilmington, North Carolina, Tulsa, Oklahoma. But these were the tip of the iceberg. This happened everywhere. The journalist Ida B. Wells said that lynching was the first example of white supremacy because it was a tool of terrorism. It dampened the ability of African American people to participate in the vibrant entrepreneurship of the late 19th and early 20th century, with a chilling message that our economic success could be punished by the rope. The economic damage to black people post-Reconstruction can be summarized in 3 ways. Number 1, we were denied the ability to participate in our nation's economic growth. The Homestead Act of 1862 did not include formerly enslaved people. More than 10% of the continental U.S. land was distributed to recent immigrants from Europe, but not black folks. So the 40 acres and a mule was given to somebody else, not us. These folks were able not only to get land, but then to get grants from the federal government to develop their land. Meanwhile, African American people were denied the right to these wealth transfers. Secondly, we were denied the right to accumulate. The paper that I mentioned talks about how our accumulation was essentially stymied by lynching. The first lynching that Ida B. Wells examined was one when a black man had the utter nerve, to open up a grocery store near a white man's store. So the white man had a brother lynched, had 3 people lynched because of economic envy. Listen to those words, economic envy. This is how black people have been suppressed in their ability to accumulate. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Wilmington, North Carolina, long stories, and I don't have any time to talk about them. But I want y'all to look at the paper that I submitted and to think about the many ways that black people who tried to participate, tried to encourage, tried to be American, simply tried to be economic actors, were suppressed because they had the nerve to think it worked. So my brothers over here who say their American dream is some people's American nightmare. Let's just be clear. Now, number 3 is public policy hostility. There's public policy hostility to black people. GI Bill legislation truncated opportunities for African American veterans. Federal Housing Administration reinforced redlining and segregation as an official policy of the federal government. People talk about racists as if they're individuals. Yes, sir. But the fact is they're not individuals. They're individuals who are buttressed by the federal government and legislation. So let me simply say, H.R. 40 is important. NARC has developed a 10-point plan. But more importantly, as you, my brothers and sisters on this Congress, go forward, may there be a racial justice audit of any new legislation that has economic implications. Thank you.
The US national debt is more than $28 trillion. It's a massive number.
Bigger than the size of our economy.
In fact, it's the biggest debt in the world, but the US government keeps spending more than it brings in.
Our rising debt levels poses a national security threat.
People need to start taking this seriously or it'll be too late.
With the COVID pandemic, government spending has exploded, even as demands for more government programs are growing. But who will end up paying for all this?
It's Washington, D.C.'s game of kicking the can, and your kids are going to be it.
Are future American generations really getting a broke country?
No.
Not all economists think the national debt is something we should worry about. One of them is Stephanie Kelton. She's a professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University.
I'm the former chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee for the Democratic staff, and I'm the author of a New York Times bestseller, The Deficit Myth.
That book has a lot of interesting ideas about government debt. We'll start with the fact that there's a big difference between you taking a loan and the government borrowing money. If you can't get money to pay your debts, your creditors can take your assets, and you could be in for a lifetime of misery. But the US government isn't you. It doesn't have to worry about where it can get the money to pay its debts because
the federal government's the issuer of the dollar. So it can never find itself in the same sort of financial trouble that you might find yourself in when it comes to paying your debt back, because the government is paying back its debt with currency that it issues itself.
Listen to that again.
The government is paying back its debt with currency that it issues itself. In other words, the federal government doesn't have to worry about earning dollars in order to repay its creditors because it gets to manufacture the currency.
This is the key point. The US government can make more money whenever it wants to pay for whatever it wants to, including its debts. That means that not only can the US federal government never go broke, it doesn't need to borrow money from anyone else.
If you stop and think about it and you say, if you could issue something,
like the US dollar,
and it could only come from you, would you ever feel the need to go get it and borrow it from anyone else?
Okay, now we've established that the federal government makes US dollars so it can never run out of them, and that's how it can always pay its debts, and that's why it never has to borrow from anyone else. So if the government doesn't need to borrow, why is there a national debt? It's a good question, but to answer that, we first have to understand what a deficit means.
Imagine that the government spends $100 into the economy, but it only taxes $90 back out. We label that a government deficit, but what we have to remember is if they put 100 in and only subtract 90 back out, what they're really doing is depositing $10 into some part of our economy.
So those $10 are actually circulating in the economy. It's a negative in the government's books, but it's a positive for the rest of us.
Every deficit is good for someone. The question is, who gets those dollars? Where do they go? And what is that deficit being used to accomplish in our economy?
Is the money going to people who'll spend it on things they otherwise can't afford, stimulating the economy more? Or is it going to people right at the top, who will likely just save it? Seeing our own money in the negative is scary. So it's understandable to have a similar reaction when we look at the government's finances. And that's probably the idea that Mitt Romney was channeling when he said,
I think it's frankly not moral for my generation to keep spending massively more than we take in, knowing those burdens are going to be passed on to the next generation.
But we know the next generation won't be paying for this spending out of their own pocket because the federal government makes US dollars so it can't go broke, which means it can always pay its debts, which means it doesn't have to borrow from anyone. Plus, deficit spending actually leaves money in the non-government part of the economy. If you're thinking there has to be a catch, that the government can't just keep printing money to fill our bucket, well, you're right. At some point, there will be too many dollars chasing too few goods, making prices go up.
We have so many dollars and we're so eager to go out and try to chase after goods and services, and our economy can't keep up. We don't have the productive capacity, and all of a sudden, all of that spending starts to overheat the economy, and the bucket begins to overflow, and you get an inflation problem.
Inflation is the actual limit to how much the government can spend, not debt. Inflation is what we have to worry about. Now, to counter inflation, the government can try to reduce demand by making it more expensive to borrow money. It can also siphon back some of that excess money by taxing it. But what if we made our bucket bigger to fit more money?
If the government is spending on things like infrastructure and education and R&D, research and development, these are the kinds of things that increase productivity and increase the economy's potential output so that you actually end up with a bigger bucket over time.
So now that we know that a deficit isn't necessarily a bad thing, and the US government can always make money, it's time to answer that earlier question. Why is there a national debt? The truth is, there isn't. As Professor Kelton explains, what we call the national debt is just the total account of all the money the government has spent over the years minus all the money the government has taxed back. Even if the government has spent more than it's collected, it doesn't have to pay anyone back for the difference. But what about when people say things like, the US owes China? Well, investors, including foreign governments, buy bonds issued by the US Treasury. The return on these investments is virtually guaranteed because the US can always create the money to pay. So there's no danger of a foreign army showing up to repossess the White House. Understanding that the US government can never run out of money and can continue deficit spending as long as inflation is kept under control means big policy ideas like universal healthcare, a Green New Deal, or student debt forgiveness might pay for themselves by keeping more money in the hands of consumers, employing more workers, and expanding the country's infrastructure. That's what happened after World War II when huge government investment led to the expansion of the middle class. But for decades now, people have been told a different story.
If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
Now, like the US, Britain also issues its own sovereign currency. So Margaret Thatcher had it wrong. When the government wants to spend, that money is made instantly. It doesn't wait for taxes. We saw that recently when the US Congress wrote trillions of dollars into existence by passing major COVID relief bills without raising taxes. So the obvious question now is, why do we pay taxes at all? Well, we pay local taxes because local governments do need revenue. They can't make money like the federal government can. And we've already seen that the federal government can use taxes as a tool to control inflation. Taxes can also be used as incentives. For example, if the government wants people to stop buying gas-powered vehicles, it could offer tax breaks on electric cars. Taxes can alter wealth distribution, spreading wealth among the population, or as the 2017 Trump tax cuts did, further concentrate wealth among a tiny slice of the population. And finally, the government makes sure we continue to need the dollar as currency by requiring that we pay it in that currency. You and your friends could agree to start paying each other in Bitcoin or euros or even chocolate bars, but you'll still need the dollar to pay the US government. A deficit doesn't mean the country is broke. Your kids won't have to pay back the national debt. Understanding this fundamentally changes our perception of what's possible. The US has been deficit spending for decades. As long as inflation is kept under control, there's no reason it shouldn't keep doing so.
The government has been running deficits virtually my entire lifetime, and I'm older than I look. And that's not to suggest that all of those deficits and everything that was done to create and sustain those deficits improved life materially for the broader society. But of course, there were times when government deficits became very large and sustained, and material improvements were made.